So good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I just wanted to thank the Dulwich Center for providing me the opportunity to share some of my work and some of the things I've been really interested in lately. For my presentation, I'm going to be sharing with you a practice project that I've been working on with community members and colleagues in my context, and I'll be sharing with you a little bit more about my context in a bit. So the title of my presentation is Exploring the Bicycle as a Metaphor for Rich Story Development, and it's a collective narrative practice project. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of my work context, as well as some acknowledgements of some contributions to my narrative practice work, and then an introduction to my narrative practice project, which is certainly a work in progress, and so I'll be telling you a little bit more about that. So my work context, I'm from Ottawa, Canada, and I work in a community called Carlington, and I'm employed as a youth counselor, and I work with counselors, primary care professionals, community developers. And in my work as a youth counselor, I work with young people in high school and in the community setting, providing individual, family, and group counseling support. I also wanted to acknowledge the ancestral and traditional Aboriginal territory of the Algonquin First Nations people, on whose territory I work, live, and play. So I'd like to share with you a number of things I've been thinking a lot about lately, and that have inspired me and contributed to some of my own practice developments and exploring narrative ideas. In particular, there's an article that was written by Marc in 2004, and he asks a number of really interesting questions. So one of the questions that he asks that really resonates with me is, how might some places be experienced as enabling of different ways of being? And so you'll see a number of pictures here of some bicycle paths, and these are located throughout the community I work with. And I think over the years and working with young people, I've heard stories about how these bike paths have been enabling for them to get more in touch with preferred accounts of their own lives, to help them connect with skills in responding to hardship or distress. And so often on my way to work, I do take these bike paths, and these stories are available for me, and I like to kind of hold close in sort of thinking it through and how I might contribute to making those stories more visible and more relevant in other young people's lives. You'll also see a little bit of a poster on this page. It says a volunteer bike clinic. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is what are some community developed successes or initiatives by young people and community members that have sort of built on some of their interests and some of their skills. And one happening in the community has been some volunteer bike clinics where young people have really showed up, been quite popular, and other community members have helped and assisted them in building or fixing their bikes. And this seemed like a really kind of a neat initiative, and it seemed to connect with these beautiful bike paths I often hear about. So it had me thinking a little bit more about how I might be able to sort of build on some of these capacities in the community. Some inspirations for my practice innovation is exploring the declarative narrative practices, and in particular the Tree of Life methodology that David Nazello had developed in 2006, and I've found that work really helpful and inspiring in having me think through the connection between the I and the we, and thinking about community contributions and thinking about social responses to social problems. As well, some contributions by young people and colleagues and friends have really helped me in terms of shaping this practice innovation and thinking through what's helpful, what seems to be working, and what should I maybe think about a little bit differently in terms of engaging with my practice. Some of the work by David Gruenwald called Critical Pedagogy of Place that I found really interesting, and he explores the work of Paulo Freire and the notion of decolonization and transformation in education, and that connection with understandings of environmental education and outdoor education, and the connection between inhabitation and how we inhabit spaces and how they contribute to our identity, and how ideas about how to sustain or support the protection of the environment, or how to sustain or honor the contribution of the land to our sense of identity and sense of community. I also wanted to acknowledge the Indigenous Australian Jane Lester and the Just Therapy team for their writings on belonging, identity, and land, which has really contributed to my understandings about the land, social justice, and the way we understand ourselves. And again, Marc Trudiger for asking the interesting question that still sort of sits with me and I like to hold is, what is the place of place in narrative therapy? And where he really sort of invited me to think about how I might re-engage with place, as well as at the same time re-engaging with history when I'm working with people. So this next slide shows sort of the interesting connection I've been learning more about over the last year of the connection between feminism and the bicycle. And so you'll see a number of really interesting images. So the histories of the bicycle in connection to the suffragette movement, histories of bicycle in terms of the therapy, and histories of the bicycle in relation to protest. And so I hope you enjoy some of these images. And I think these have sort of contributed to my own thinking in my work, and how I position myself in terms of masculinity and dominant culture, and to be more vigilant in thinking about how I might be reproducing privilege, and some maybe not taking for account some taken for granted assumptions about gender. So feminisms have really kind of continued to challenge me to think through some of those questions in my own narrative practice. And you'll also see some images of here that seeing the connection of bicycling and narrative practice of Michael White and David Epstein. And their work has had an immeasurable influence on the way I think about my own identity and think about my engagement with people in my attempts to support them on their journeys and in response to some of the life challenges that they're facing. So here's an image of my practice project. And so it's really a translation. It's translation work and co-research work. So in this image, you'll see on the top, Forest of Life from the Tree of Life methodology. And below, you'll see an image of the Bicycle of Life. And so what I've done is I've explored the steps from the Tree of Life and have translated them into stages for the Bicycle of Life. So you'll see for the stages of the Bicycle of Life, and I'll walk through them with you, that stage 1 is the Bicycle of Life and creating a bicycle. Stage 2 is creating a Peloton and a community map. And stage 3 is exploring the road conditions of life with young people. And stage 4 is certificates and a celebration ride. So for this presentation, I'm going to be sharing with you in more detail stages 1 through 3. So here's an image of a Bicycle of Life, and you'll see at the front tire it says the future and the rear tire says the past. And this is an example of some work that I've done with a young person who's given me permission to share some of our conversation and some of his story. I've altered some of the information just to provide a greater amount of anonymity for him. And I want to share with you some of his knowledges and skills in living that we managed to learn about together in our conversation and creating a bicycle of life. So the rear tire of the bicycle represents the significant geographical territories of life, the places and spaces that a person has inhabited. The rear tire also represents the past to present. So some of the questions that I explored with Mo, the young person, that you can see the image of his rear tire, is where is home for you? What are some of your favorite places to spend time? Why is this a favorite place? Are there any sacred or culturally significant spaces that you spend time, or places that you've been to in the past, or even places that you'd like to go to? In your daily travels, what are some local places that you visit and spend time? Are these indoor, outdoor? So it's really getting a rich description of the significance of places and spaces in the young person's life. And my hope is that we can build on that, and it can contribute to rich story development. So some of the places that Mo has identified, as you can see, and I'll just name a few, is home, Canada, Damascus, the mosque, and Strathcona Park. So for some of these, I might ask him a little bit more and describe these places to get a sense of the images of these places, to get a sense of feel for these places. The rear wheel spokes represent significant figures in a person's past to present. Participants are invited to draw spokes on their rear wheels to represent the significant figures in their lives. And this could be family members, friends, significant figures in their lives. It could be inspirational people, it could be teachers, it could be imaginary friends, it could be pets. You can see that Mo has identified a number of people, some that are very much in his present, and some are very much in his past, from his grade 1 teacher, Mrs. K, to a book he read recently by Robert Lang, who is an architect that he finds really inspiring. So the next step in building the bike is exploring the strengths, the knowledges, the skills in living of the young person. So, and these are kind of conversations that can kind of weave back to the rear tire to explore some of the geography or some of the significant figures. So some of the interests and abilities and skills and qualities that Mo identified were a passion for building, caring and calm, family person, and loyal. And these are all connected to social histories. Get to learn about. So you can see on the rear tire, I asked Mo a little bit about Mr. Green, who he identified as a significant figure on his rear wheel spoke. And I asked Mo if he could look at himself through Mr. Green's eyes and describe himself. And so Mo described himself through Mr. Green's eyes as hardworking. And I asked him, what goes into being hardworking? What do you think this skill requires? Which Mo responded by patience skills, and he shared a story about using his patience skills in class. From there, that can support me to explore the history of this patience skill and where else in his life he's utilized his skills. And it adds to Mo identifying being a hardworking person and caring and calming, which led to another rich description of his own identity and another story connecting him to another family member, being his uncle. So one of the things that I find helpful in terms of exploring these stories and linking and utilizing the metaphor of a bicycle for rich story development is the bicycle chain. And so I find this is a helpful reminder for me to ask questions and to bring up the question when I'm meeting with a young person about links. So asking about links to culture, links to social history, and links to significant places. So the chain really kind of provides us as a metaphor to begin to explore some of those histories together. So for example, for the bicycle chain, one of the links was place. So Mo identified his friend Emil's home as a place where he developed an interest in building model airplanes. He also was able to make a link to social history when I asked him about who would not be surprised to hear about this, who also shares an appreciation for building with you. And he identified his uncle Ahmed, who was also another figure on his rear wheel spoke. And this supported us to have a remembering conversation where I got to learn more about his interest in building and some of those skills and values that are connected to that. Also through the bicycle chain, we're able to make a link to some unique outcomes in his life. And I explored with him how he managed to stay connected to some of these interests in building despite the influence of depression. And this supported us to have a reauthoring conversation. We explored some of his responses to the depression and how he managed to stay connected to some of these preferred ways of being. Also, the link supported in exploring future hopes. So what kind of skills and abilities will you need to draw upon in building a home? And this was a hope that he identified. And then I'll be talking to you a little bit more on the front tire, which is a future orientation. So on the front tire, identifying the hopes and future journeys and destinations. So the front tire represents the near to distant future. Participants are invited to write down on the front tire their hopes, wishes, dreams, visions, and goals for the future. These may be hopes for themselves or others, for community, for the bioregion, for the world, for other young people. And participants may locate these hopes to particular places or spaces in their lives. So in this image, this next image of the front tire, you can see how Mo wrote down some of his hopes and dreams for the future, having more connection with family, for peace, for building a home, for being a civil engineer one day. And a closer, more near kind of hope was to play soccer and to make some more friends. The next part in the step of building the bicycle life is identifying the front tire spokes. These front tire spokes represent the bike club of life, drawing upon Michael White's idea of the club of life. So participants are invited to identify the significant figures that they would like to have in their preferred futures. Participants can be invited to link their spokes to some of the significant figures and to put the particular hopes and goals and dreams inscribed on their front tires. So as you can see, Mo identified his mom, his dad, his uncle and aunt, and they're linked to the hope of having more family connection. And so we did this throughout the bike and linking some of these hopes to significant figures and exploring the connection between these. The next step in the process is building a bicycle basket. And as you can see, Mo has quite a few things that he's added into his bicycle basket. So the basket represents the particular skills and abilities, understandings and knowledge that the young person feels that would be relevant to helping them along their way towards a particular destination, towards a particular dream or goal in their life. And supports us in a conversation to share, to find out if this is a shared journey, who would be in this journey with you, how would they support you, how would you support them, what particular skills or knowledge might inspire you on this journey, might nourish you, might energize or sustain you, might repair or reorient you on this path or route that you might be taking. It can also support us in having conversations about if you have a flat tire, who might pump your tire for you, or who might help you along the way in fixing your bike. So as you can see, Mo has identified faith, believing in myself, hard work, having that knowledge about himself, about his hard work skills, his patience skills, his belief in the Prophet of Yusuf, and creativity is some of the things he'd like to bring along with him in relation to particular hopes and goals that he has for himself. So the next part of the stage of the bicycle of life is bringing the bikes together. So in this image here, you can see a bunch of bikes that are together in a pack or what you can call a Peloton. So at this stage in the process, the bikes are brought together by group members to create a Peloton to explore, and I believe that the Peloton is a really rich metaphor for exploring social action, collective knowledge, and community. So bringing these bicycles together to form a Peloton becomes a really strong and rich image in the room that can support us in creating second story development before exploring the effects of problems and talking about broader concerns that might be happening in the community. Australian cyclist Matthew Lloyd describes the Peloton he rides in as a moving community. In a Peloton, cyclists form groups where members at the front work 40% harder than those riding from behind. Working in a cohesive unit, team members move in and out of the lead role to conserve their energy and to share the riding conditions among the group. And I just think that this is a really beautiful metaphor for exploring the connections, the shared knowledge, and collective understandings that can be supported in this process. So the next step after creating the Peloton is beginning to explore some of the common or shared geographies that participants in the group might have, and through that creating a bicycle map. And I guess one of the considerations that I have in thinking about some of those shared places is that it's important to me to explore with young people the second story development in relation to community. So what are those places and spaces that contribute to a sense of well-being, that contribute to a sense of community, and contribute to a sense of belonging? And so initially in exploring these the bicycle map with young people, I would ask them to identify some of the places in the community that disconnects them from community or promotes hopelessness. And I learned through feedback from young people that this is kind of an unsafe thing to do. And it had me really kind of thinking through a little bit about the idea of panopticism and surveillance, and that often map mapping is done to communities or can be done to young people, and asking them or positioning them in ways that aren't safe to talk about community. And so it's been really, really important learning for me in terms of exploring community is to really focus on those stories of connection, belonging, those preferred stories, and not to contribute to the totalizing of communities, and then therefore the totalizing of young people's lives any further. So, and there's a question that Marc Trudiger asks is, how is the taken for grantedness of places contested by individuals and communities? So I like to think about these community bike path maps as a way to contest the taken for grantedness of places, and might be some dominant stories about place, and contribute to alternate stories, or maybe some of those subordinate story lines related to community, the stories that contribute to well-being, community, belonging, and connection. Another way to kind of think about this is to think about these maps as a form of thick mapping. So it's thickening stories about community, thickening stories about interconnection among young people, and thickening local knowledges about community of young people. So some of the questions that I ask, that I was inspired by remembering conversations in terms of thinking about place. So here are some of the questions that I ask young people as we're facilitating this bicycle or co-researching this community bike math path. So some of the questions are, what do you like to do in this space? What do you do to share? Who do you share this space with? What does this space bring to your life? And what do you bring to this space's life? And how has this space changed over time? What places do people find help them put them more in touch with preferred counts of their lives? Is a question that really kind of inspires me. So after we've created a bicycle path map, the third stage is exploring the road conditions of life. And very much like the tree of life, exploring the storms that affect forests, in a very similar way, I've kind of thought about the metaphor of road conditions and the metaphors that might come with that. And so young people that I've consulted with, there's been some really neat metaphors that they've contributed and that I'll be sharing with you. So when I think about exploring the road conditions of life, these are externalizing conversations about social problems. It's also drawing on the idea from Paulo Freire of reading the world. So being in a situation and reading the world critically. These conversations also include identifying and richly describing response knowledges of young people in response to these broader social problems. So in reading the world, some considerations of power and privilege that challenge me and that I think about in terms of this project and then the work that I do is thinking about how does gender, ability, race, class, sexual orientation have an influence in constituting some of the roads, paths, and routes in life? And in what ways are some routes and paths in life unwelcoming, risky, incredibly dangerous, and unimaginable, or just really boring because of these intersectionalities, these differences, these power differentials? It also has me thinking as well about alternate or non-normative routes that young people might be taking in their life, being interested about that. And also wondering in ways how might power and privilege be operating by smoothing out the path for some while creating barriers for others. Also, in what ways are paths and spaces constituted through operations of power and privilege, and how does that change over time? And how might the reality of one person being in one space be completely different for someone else because of these differences, because of power and privilege? So for example, with the group exploring what might be some spaces that are unsafe or unwelcoming for young people. What might be some spaces that are unwelcoming or unsafe for a trans youth? How so, and who benefits from this, and why? As part of the process in exploring the road conditions of life is creating a collective community document with young people as a way to richly describe the broader social problems, the obstacles and difficult terrains faced, and as well as a way of identifying and richly describing the response knowledges by young people. So in this next slide, entitled The Road Conditions of Life, this is a growing document that I'm working on and continuing to in my work with young people in the community. And it's something that I share sometimes with young people that I might be working with individually as a way for the group to contribute to other young people's lives and to sort of break down the isolating effects that sometimes individual counseling brings and that problems certainly bring. So some of the road hazards that I've got to learn about are violence, abuse, bullying, crime, drugs, pollution, racism, perfectionism, and illness. And here is also a list of some of the obstacles and difficult terrains faced by young people as well. Also in the collective documents is recording some of the road wisdom of young people that I referred to. So the responses to road hazards, to road obstacles, and some of the difficult terrain. And here's a quote from a young person and describing and overcoming and being able to graduate from high school despite some pretty significant odds. He said, "I've learned that when you climb a steep mountain, you'll pick up enough speed on your way down that the hills in front of you become little bumps on the road." That I think is really inspiring me and having me think about what might be some of those hills and little bumps that I might take for granted had I not climbed a big mountain like him. And so I just find these metaphors can be very rich and exploring response knowledges, alternate stories, and even characterizing broader social problems. And for my last slide, just going to share with you just very briefly an exciting community practice project that I'm working on with some colleagues at a local school that I'm working with and colleagues at my workplace. And in a number of months, we're going to be doing a 20-week group with the Bicycle of Life and further exploring it. And it's my hope that be able to further grow this community document, this collective practice document, and be able to record more of young people's knowledges, insider knowledge related to the road conditions of life. And part of this project is also going to include young people learning to build a bicycle. So we'll have some mechanics in, and out of recycled bicycle parts, they'll be able to create their own bike. And we're planning some community bike rides to help us explore the bike path of life, and hopefully further contribute to some of these preferred story developments. So I hope to be able to stay in touch and share people, provide some updates with people if they're certainly interested. So these are some of the practices in relation to community narrative practice work that are really inspiring for me, that have really stretched me. And this is continually evolving and changing, and it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to learn about practice and learn from young people about community and the significance of place. So thank you very much.